Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for attending our presentation. My name is Dan Marks. I'm the power editor for African Energy, the publication, and African Energy Live Data, which is the platform behind the data that we're showing today. It's an ongoing service, a database of power projects across Africa, across the industry, from small scale mini grids and commercial and industrial all the way up to giant mega dams. It has more than 6,600 projects at the present time. And yeah, it's continually updated by our team in the United Kingdom and correspondents across Africa. So today we're presenting our figures for 2020. It's the installed capacity added, various technologies, different types of ownership, and presenting some of our thoughts around what the data tells us about where the power sector is in Africa at the present time. So I think with that, I'll hand over to Mark, who is a research analyst who works for Live Data, has done a lot of work on the data behind this presentation, and also for African Energy Consultancy. And he's going to lead off with an introduction to the figures and an overview of what's been going on in the continent. He'll be followed by John Hamilton, who is our managing director and an expert on North Africa, and he'll be explaining some of the trends in that region, what's been happening to drive the numbers. And then I'll be doing similar for sub-Saharan Africa with some comments on what's been happening on the ground and the kind of some of the trends behind the data. So with that, I think best hand over to Mark, who can get us underway.
Thank you, Dan. Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you're dialing in from. As Dan says, I'll be providing you with a general overview of the status of the power sector in 2020, as well as a bit of a retrospective covering this last decade. So if you just give me one moment, I will share my screen. Hopefully that is displaying properly for everybody. So let's move on to our first slide. So here's basically a key summary of our findings from 2020 and the key figures. As you can see, net additions were down, and it was even prior to COVID, the growth in the sector was already slowing down markedly. And the reason for this is, in our analysis, is simply that nearly all countries on the continent are still in the midst of a process of reform, particularly in power sector markets, and also responding to the energy transition and the imperatives thereof. And that's the theme that my colleagues and I will be exploring further throughout today's presentation. There is, obviously, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some good, there is some good news, I should say. Over a third of all new capacity is from renewables. However, this addition was dwarfed by that of gas. You can see there 3.2 gigawatts of capacity added in the last year. In sub-Saharan Africa, this was the worst year in terms of added capacity, with just 1.6 gigawatts. However, another piece of good news, though, is in sub-Saharan Africa, renewables are becoming extremely important in terms of overall aggregate capacity being added on an annual basis. And as my colleague John Hamilton will discuss in much more detail, gas is clearly predominant in the North Africa region. However, there is certainly grounds for optimism, and the Live Data database has already recorded this year, 2021, confirmed 3.2 gigawatts of capacity is online already. So a degree of bounce back is certainly anticipated. So moving on, this is the state of play for last year. This is our scorecard, and you can see that for the continent as a whole, installed capacity has kept up with population growth, but the increase in installed capacity has not. However, there is good news. You can see in terms of GDP growth, installed capacity keeping up with that, and the proportion of renewables increasing, along with, interestingly, non-hydro renewables. As we're all keenly aware, large hydropower plants coming online can add a huge amount of capacity in one fell swoop. And the proportion of liquid fuels, importantly, has decreased too, which is clearly very important in terms of meeting SDG 7 goals and aiding the energy transition. I won't go through the regional figures of the scorecard in depth, but these slides will be available afterwards if people wish to browse them in more detail. So in terms of the impact of COVID-19, African Energy has conducted a significant amount of qualitative research over the last sort of 4 or 5 months. We've spoken to hundreds of project developers, EPC contractors, major financiers, utilities, off-takers, equipment supply companies, and all other major stakeholders within the industry. And we've gained, I think, quite a good appraisal of the impact of this pandemic year upon the power sector in particular. Now, many developers have noted the impact of COVID-19 upon the expected commercial operations date of projects that were under development when the pandemic hit. However, we were told by many financiers and even some EPC contractors that COVID had a relatively small impact, and the feeling or the sentiment, and I should stress that this is more anecdotal than a rigorous systematic analysis, but certainly a strong feeling prevalent among those that we've spoken to, is that COVID's overall impact upon the addition of new capacity to Africa's power sector is likely going to prove less severe than many initially feared at the outset of the pandemic. And we've seen many projects suffering only minor or relatively minor delays prior to coming online. This qualitative data has made it clear that in the main, the impact of COVID-19 related restrictions was largely confined to 4 aspects, and these were delays in accessing imported components or fluctuations in prices thereof owing to market interruptions, working restrictions upon EPC staff and contractors, and that often prolonged the construction phase of projects that were under development. Now, many developers and contractors that we've spoken to have said that they have been covered by the force majeure provisions of the agreements that they're carrying out developments under. Although COVID may have impacted cash flow, it wasn't an existential risk for many of them. However, what we found is that many subcontractors, who clearly are depended upon quite heavily in a lot of projects, have particularly suffered because they haven't had these guarantees or assurances. And this may have had a knock-on effect upon the completion timelines of some projects. And lastly, clearly travel restrictions have had an impact upon project developments, especially for projects that require the entry of technical staff from abroad, such as OEM staff installing specialist equipment or so forth, or consulting engineers. And certainly the last word on this is that some cynical voices have pointed out to us that COVID-19 has potentially provided a ready-made rationale or perhaps excuse, if you're being even more cynical, for projects that may have in any case been delayed owing to other unrelated factors. Of course, it's very difficult to delineate that, but the key finding, I think the key takeaway, is that COVID, although it may have prolonged some projects, has not perhaps been as catastrophic as may have been expected this time a year ago, for instance. So moving on, this is the state of play in terms of the energy mix for the continent as a whole in 2020. And you can see a breakdown here on the pie chart. The dominance of natural gas is clear, and we can see 73 gigawatts of overall capacity there, dwarfing its nearest competitors, coal and liquid fuels. Hydropower, perhaps as expected, is the most prominent renewable source, but still only accounts for just over half that of natural gas. And although large strides have been made in terms of increasing solar and wind capacity, they account for mere fractions of the larger fuel sources. In terms of the long view, we can see that while coal and liquid fuels have remained consistently prominent over the last 20 years, a few fuel types have increasingly come to account for much of Africa's capacity, and natural gas and hydro in particular have enabled that expansion of generation capacity and increasing electricity access rates particularly. And I should stress that over obviously the 5 years forward from 2020, our projections and obviously would be subject to change there. So looking at the trends over the last decade, we can see that installed capacity has increased significantly, and the role of the state has also remained prominent. At no point has state ownership of power plants dropped below 60% of installed capacity. And as the inset bar chart shows, this one here, there's no discernible shift towards private sector ownership over the last decade either, which is another quite interesting finding from the data set. Perhaps people may have expected an increased role overall for the private sector. Another interesting aspect, slightly difficult to make out, you can see at the top that rental power has emerged, albeit from a very small base, as a viable option for many off-takers, and companies such as Aggreko, Karl-Powership and Kohler have increasingly been providing solutions to countries in need of temporary or emergency power. In 2019, a record 482 megawatts of rental power was in operation, and this figure will likely increase further as we see players such as Karl-Powership in particular increasing their rental power offerings in several key markets. So in terms of the additions to grid capacity continent-wide in the last decade, you can see natural gas continuing to dominate there. In 2018 alone, 14.7 gigawatts of natural gas capacity was added. And this is particularly pronounced in North Africa, as I mentioned, and my colleague John Hamilton will discuss that in more detail shortly. And while solar and wind have grown considerably from a very low base 10 years ago, they still comprise just a small fraction of new on-grid capacity. So for instance, just 822 megawatts of wind and 876 megawatts of solar were added in 2020. Furthermore, major hydropower developments that have come online have intermittently contributed much to these aggregate figures, such as Ghana's 400 megawatt Bui hydro, Guinea's Suapiti hydro, and Cote d'Ivoire's Subre hydro. So we see these large hydro plants, they don't come on especially frequently, but over the last decade, they've clearly made a big impact upon the figures. In sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, there is a stark difference in the provenance of natural gas. Although, as I mentioned in the last slide, wind and solar capacity on an all-Africa basis remain or comprise a relatively low proportion of overall capacity added, this does vary significantly by region. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we can see that renewables accounted for 2,456 megawatts, or 70% of capacity added in 2020, which is very promising. And my colleague Dan Marks will discuss this in much more detail shortly, but we'll see how in Southern Africa, solar projects have continued to play a very prominent role, and especially in that key market of South Africa. And furthermore, it is important to note that new coal projects in sub-Saharan Africa also retain significant importance. And this trend has actually increased in the latter part of the decade, which again may be surprising to some industry watchers. So looking at the trends in off-grid and embedded markets, it's important to stress that this aspect of our data, of the live data service, will very likely overrepresent wind and solar, for the very simple reason that those projects tend to be quite well publicized by their developers, and the database will likely underrepresent other fuel sources, particularly liquid fuels, i.e. diesel, which are often commissioned with no public announcement or communication even from the developers, so they're much harder to track. So thus, while it is evident that West Africa is where this part of the sector has enjoyed the most growth, the true extent of off-grid and embedded generation in West Africa is likely far higher than is possible to capture in any kind of data set. And this was encapsulated by the IFC, who in 2019 conservatively estimated that in Nigeria alone, there may well be between 15 and 20 gigawatts of diesel generator capacity. So it's just these figures should be interpreted with that caution in mind. But nonetheless, we can see a key, a very clear trajectory of growth in the off-grid and embedded sector, and particularly in terms of embedded commercial and industrial projects, we do anticipate in the next 5 years to come a much larger offering in key markets such as Kenya and South Africa and Ghana, where developers and industrial and commercial consumers are increasingly turning to embedded solutions. So in terms of continent-wide new off-grid capacity by fuel type, natural gas also remains dominant in the continent-wide off-grid and embedded market, although clearly to a lesser extent than on-grid. And as would perhaps be expected, wind and solar have come to play an increasingly important role in these markets, especially towards the end of the decade. The emergence of renewables has come at the expense of natural gas and liquid fuels, and there's a marked decline observable. But even in sub-Saharan Africa, where renewables are increasingly an important source of off-grid embedded power, the market remains dominated by natural gas and liquid fuels, which alone, those two types account for 64% of or added generation. So, and as I mentioned before, the emergence of renewables, in particular in off-grid and embedded C&I projects, is promising, but there remains considerable ground to be made up in order to reach parity with gas or non-renewable sources. And certainly from the developers that we speak to, a lot of the, let's say a key factor in holding back the development of renewables in off-grid and C&I, the hurdles there are regulatory or legislative, but certainly we're seeing those barriers, if not being torn down, at least being eased slightly in important markets. And it should also be noted that biomass has emerged as an important and increasingly profitable fuel type, and in particular industrial off-takers have utilised it to add reliable, renewable, and it's essentially profitable embedded capacity. And bagasse plants in particular have proven very viable in countries such as Malawi and Ethiopia. And lastly from me, in terms of the continent-wide new capacity or net new capacity in terms of ownership, what's really clear is that overall new capacity is falling far short of what's required in sub-Saharan Africa. It's very well known that there's a colossal power deficit. The best estimates state that perhaps some 580 million people in Africa still lack any access to electricity whatsoever. So it's been obvious for quite some time that more private sector investment is sorely needed, not just to plug this gap, but also to meet SDG 7. So in this context, it's very noteworthy that it was only in 2020 that private sector owned projects accounted for more than 50% of new capacity. So this raises several questions. It also speaks to the imperative that there's much more to be done by funders, policymakers, governments, and DFIs to increase the number of IPPs. One thing that we should note is that, particularly over the last year, I've certainly observed that where private capacity has been added in frontier markets, it's made a huge impact. And so we're looking at countries such as Rwanda, Malawi, Burundi, Mali, and Zimbabwe. And these markets have demonstrated that when developers are enabled, IPPs can bring affordable, cost-reflective power to people in the midst of what many would consider very challenging market circumstances. So that wraps up my part of the presentation today. Thank you very much. And of course, there's the opportunity to ask questions in the comments. So thank you.
Great. So I think we'll take questions at the end and go straight on to John. I think you're on mute there, John.
I'm on mute and I'm about to share my screen, so forgive me if I mix this up, but let me try and get this up. So you've got my okay, here we go. Right, with any luck, you should be able to see that clearly. There's a rule I understand in stage drama that the more neat and orderly the set is when the curtain goes up, the more likely it is to be in a complete mess by the time it drops at the end of the last act. And so with that in mind, we're starting here with what is basically quite a neat and orderly and perhaps even sort of reassuring slide showing that the trend for the expected increase in installed capacity over the next few years tracks official projections for economic growth quite closely. Now, Mark's already mentioned, but I think it's worth reiterating that these additional megawatts in the sort of lighter shaded part of the chart, which is the pipeline, can all be tracked back to specific projects with identified expected commissioning dates in our database. So that's why it flattens off after 2024, because no one is really talking about dates for renewable plants beyond then. You can also see, on the GDP line, COVID has certainly flattened forecast economic growth in the region both last year and this. But despite that, a lot of power is being added to the grid. Now, as we continue the story, you can see that there's a lot which underlies this particular narrative, and it changes somewhat as we go on. So, looking at North Africa in terms of installed capacity by fuel, this slide shows how gas-fired capacity has doubled over the past 4 years. We're obviously looking at that sort of light orange layer at the sort of base of the graph. And the vital point here, I think, is that according to the pipeline, there's yet more gas-fired capacity to be added in the region. And so, as it stands today, gas generation will continue to drive a trend in growth of capacity over the next several years. But even this snapshot of the pipeline does not tell us everything. You can see at the top in green and yellow a substantial broadening of the wind and solar pipeline, and particularly when you factor in the lack of renewable projects with expected commission dates after sort of 2023, 2024. Now, to take a slightly different perspective looking at this and to see who has built and who is expected to build new generation in North Africa, and an even more complex picture emerges, I think. First of all, we can see that very few IPPs were commissioned in the region in 2020, and we'll go on and discuss why in a bit more in the next slide. But looking from 2022 onwards, there is a potential commercial shift being suggested here, particularly from 2023 to 2026. Each year, at least half of new capacity will be from IPPs rather than state-led procurement. I mean, an enormous shift from what has taken place previously. I mean, you have to go all the way back to 2002, 2003 to see, much lower numbers. When there was a bit of an IPP surge back there. So here we go. This slide, I think, is the most interesting of all when you really get into the nitty gritty. So we'll start with gas. Once again, the light orange on the column. Now the enormous column in 2018 is dominated by the 3 Siemens plants in Egypt, and there are obviously some other projects as well. There's an interesting counterfactual to consider here, which is that the 8.4 gigawatt GE program, that kicked off in Algeria, nearly a decade ago. Those plants were supposed to be built much sooner. I mean, they are, in fact, at least half of them are still in the pipeline going up to 2024. But and some were completed last year, and some are being completed this year. So, first of all, we're seeing the results of decisions made in 2011, 2012, but also I think you need to, I mean, it's remarkable to think about that enormous column in 2018 might have been half as high again if some of those projects had not run into sort of quite serious sort of logistical problems, and which we covered in actually the last issue of African Energy last week. And amongst those plants, I mean, if you look at the 2024 column, only gas in that column. About half of that is the Mostaganem project in Algeria, and then the other half is Aqua's Luxor plant in Egypt, for which construction is supposed to start this year, but we don't actually know whether it will or not. Looking forward into the pipeline as well, you've got Libya's frantic gas procurement program, dependent on installing FSRUs along the coast. Perhaps it's necessary, but it's also a desperate indictment of the cost of the past decade of conflict. That is, the best answer they have to dealing with their power, their lack of power right now. You've got Morocco still thinking of some new gas-fired baseload linked to LNG imports. However, the large Al Wahda plant, which was once planned and in the pipeline for 2021, when we, back in what we had it in live data a few years ago, now expected commissioning has been pushed back to 2025. And of course, there's no guarantee that any of those gas-fired projects that you're looking at there will actually be completed in time. And I would say a high likelihood that some of them will be pushed back even further. So overall, when you look at this chart, I think what we're seeing here in sort of infographic form is the high watermark of gas procurement in North Africa, and I think probably over the whole of the African continent. And if anything, the future will hold more of that dip into negative territory that you can also see in 2018 as old and inefficient plants, non-price competitive plants, are eventually decommissioned. So this is the context of the coming renewables revolution in North Africa. But take a look at 2020. There's a thin, almost invisible sliver of yellow in that column just under the green. That represents the solar capacity commissioned last year in 2020 in all of North Africa. You heard me talk about a revolution, but you could be forgiven for observing that it's a pretty tiny revolution, if that's what it adds up to. So what's going on? There are some concerns that Egypt's solar program has been too successful and that the government has slowed project approvals to sort of defend the kind of established state-owned interests. It could also be that the highly competitive pricing framework there has caused investors to hold back a bit. And I think there's also an element that Mark referred to a bit in his comments earlier of regulatory change, and the fact that we're seeing a shift from one type of procurement to another, and maybe that 2020 also represents a bit of a pause for breath before they start again. And there are some key decisions expected this year and next, and a lot of renewables in the forward pipeline, a lot of some very big solar projects, and some climate targets which Egypt is very committed to hit. By the way, just as an aside before we go on, that hydro you see in 2025, that's all in just one project. That's Egypt's Ataka pump storage project. I'll be absolutely frank, it's not a scheme I've ever been able to get my head around, but that's its expected commissioning date, and so there it is. Looking back at Morocco, the granddaddy of solar development, I think we're seeing it really pay the price for being the first mover in this market, and it's caused a bit of a crisis of confidence at Mazen. I think we'll see, and we covered a lot of that in mid-April in African Energy issue 436. At the same time, their CNI opportunity has also really stalled and won't get going again until they open that medium voltage grid to the market. I'm sure there's plenty of people here on the presentation who would love to get a chance to sell power directly to some of that, I don't know if you could call it the sort of middle stand of Moroccan sort of small and medium-sized businesses, particularly those with good credit ratings. But it's going to be a massive challenge for Ono when, if they ever decide to take that step. Algeria is once again trying to have a renewables program. We wrote about that in the last issue, but none of those figures are here. It's just too early. And Tunisia's renewables program has also suffered some technical difficulties and some institutional reluctance. But you've got institutions like the EBRD with a sort of support package trying to help them overcome that. And as I've mentioned, Libya's rulers, they just got other stuff on their mind right now. It's but one day, renewables will come there as well. So we're looking, I think, here at an inflection point. And I think it's certain that we will see both many more IPPs and also a lot more renewables being built in North Africa in the years to come. But what is also certain is that progress is just not going to represent that neat and easy slide which I showed you at the beginning. It's going to be a much more lumpy ride than that initial slide suggested. There we are. I will hand back to you, Dan.
Thanks. Just my turn to share my screen. So I'll just do that now. Yeah, so hopefully, can you, sorry, John, can you tell me if you can, I think you maybe see my Zoom thing there, I probably don't need that. Great. Okay, so I'm looking at sub-Saharan Africa, mostly excluding South Africa, although we can talk about that as well. And I want to ask similar questions, but I think of a very different region, and ask the question in particular of whether the industry as a whole has lost focus a little bit, particularly on generation. The last couple of years have seen a growing realization that you can't simply financially engineer your way around structural issues in power sectors in Africa, and that there's a real limit to the degree to which you can isolate IPPs from systems and structures, economic structures that simply don't work. And this has led to a very positive focus on transmission, reducing losses and distribution, on structures, on reducing the cost of generation, on improving metering and things like that. But I think also it's very clear that it's resulted in a neglect of generation, and also it's not been accompanied by the kind of decisive reform action that is required in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's been a focus on some change, some tariff reform, some work with utilities, but fundamentally the structure of many markets across sub-Saharan Africa is not suitable for the means to which it's meant to be put, which is to attract large amounts of private investment so that government can focus its resources elsewhere. As you can see, sub-Saharan Africa was hit particularly badly by COVID-19 in terms of the power sector, worse than the rest. It doesn't show up very well on the larger graphics, because the amount of capacity being added in sub-Saharan Africa when you take out South Africa and also North Africa, when you've got the whole continent, is so small. Of that 7,800 megawatts, you only have 1,500 added in sub-Saharan Africa, if you exclude South Africa. So this was the lowest since 2009. the region was really particularly hit by travel restrictions in particular, with also associated kind of equipment delays and sudden changes in prices, as well as also, of course, the financial impact of COVID on governments, especially in oil exporting economies, and just a change in priority for governments with limited human resources and capacity. 2021 is likely to see some bounce back. The second half of 2020 did see work resume on lost projects, and quite a few were close to commissioning towards the end of the year. Live Data has recorded already 1.8 gigawatts of new capacity. If you include South Africa, only 900 megawatts if South Africa is excluded. That's this year. Certainly, the slowdown cannot be entirely blamed on the pandemic. 2019 was already the slowest year since 2014. As I say, quite in large part due to changes in structure, which are resulting in a slowdown of state investment in power generation, while at the same time not seeing major increases while seeing increases in private generation, but not enough. As we'll see later on. There's also been a major slowdown in the larger markets, particularly Kenya, Ghana and Nigeria. Kenya, where none of the promised solar projects have come online. Both Kenya and Ghana have been effectively using oversupply as an excuse to avoid hard decisions over the future of Kenya Power and the Electricity Company of Ghana. I think it's quite instructive to look at the UK just as a kind of comparator, obviously as a developed market, and what that looks like as a market which already has as much capacity as it needs and is just treading water. And you see in the UK alone, 1.2 gigawatts of just renewables was added between Q3 2019 and Q3 2020, compared to all of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, more than 40 countries, adding 1.5 in total. And in the UK, that was despite a significant fall in consumption and an even more significant fall in economic growth compared to African countries. And I think we will discuss again how the kind of oversupply situation and how effectively this kind of slowdown in the major markets has affected sub-Saharan Africa and the figures. So here you can see sub-Saharan Africa excluding South Africa and the net capacity. So you can see a sizable slowdown clearly for 2020, as well as the changing composition of capacity additions over time from predominantly gas and liquid fuels in the 2000s. Obviously, very much less capacity was being added to an increasing volume of new hydropower, solar, wind, and geothermal capacity. Future pipelines, which will certainly not be fully realized, but give an indication of the prospective mix. I think it's instructive to see that, I mean, although COVID was there, only 38% of capacity that was in the pipeline for 2020 actually came online. But the pipeline shows a clear trend towards hydropower, wind, and solar. But I think it is also important to say that for the time being, these are really largely theoretical until they are realized and online. As John mentioned, for North Africa, I think you are at an inflection point. But I think for sub-Saharan Africa, it's a much more serious problem. Whereas North Africa has 100% access, industrialized economies, and fairly modern grids, sub-Saharan Africa cannot afford this slowdown of new capacity and growth. I think what can be said is that the new wind and solar capacity is quite frequently having very significant impact. A lot of the capacity is in frontier markets, which have really begun to embrace IPPs, in particular solar IPPs, with assistance from development finance institutions. They make a huge amount of difference in reducing thermal, diesel and HFO consumption, reducing foreign exchange exposure, reducing costs. So while there's while there has been not a huge amount of wind and solar, this is in sub-Saharan Africa excluding South Africa, it has been very significant, and it's been quite often in frontier markets, and I think this is a trend that will continue. 2020 was also a significant year for battery technology, which is anticipated both to, well, it's needed both to help with the integration of solar and wind power, but also to help manage grids. Large-scale initiatives are underway in South Africa, Kenya, and Senegal, but also in frontier markets like Malawi and Central African Republic, where they are tied to solar IPPs. Fortunes of the technology can certainly be contrasted with concentrated solar power, which has fallen completely out of favor in Morocco, may have been one factor behind recent problems for its Marsden's Head, and was left out of the 2019 integrated resource plan in South Africa entirely, other than plants that had already been committed. So there are also technological inflection at the moment. So here you can see kind of changes, and again, there's a focus on sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, but quite significant changes in the kind of composition of ownership and where investment is coming from, with increasing proportions from the state, but I think very significant increases in rental power, and that's because of what the increase in rental power actually implies about what's happening in the sector. So the absolute capacity added by the private sector has increased considerably, from an average of 1.1 gigawatt each year between 2001 and 2005 to an average of nearly 2 gigawatts between 2011 and 2015, and an average of 2.8 gigawatts between 2016 and 2020. In 2020 saw 2.2 gigawatts of privately owned capacity online despite COVID-19. So again, excluding South Africa. The proportion of privately owned capacity has remained relatively stable though, although this graph, you can see it reduced here in 2012-14. Actually 2000 to 2010 saw similar proportions, just a lot less absolute volume because less capacity was being added. The increase in rental capacity is certainly notable, considering the narrative of oversupply and efforts to reduce the cost of tariffs. The nature of rental capacity has changed in many cases, which is worth stating, both with car powership, which accounts for a lot of this capacity, which is in quite a lot of cases more affordable than some previous versions, but also rental commercial and industrial systems, which also show up to some extent in the figures. So rental power has always been seen as potentially, well, the argument has always been that it can be used as a useful tool to bridge supply gaps while power plants are built. But in too many cases in this region, supply gaps that are being plugged have been entirely avoidable, and are the result of long delays to projects in the pipeline, usually because of policy and regulatory failures, failure to procure in time because of poor planning, or failure to complete transmission lines. And I think that this is something which I was implying by the title I gave to my presentation, which is, has there been a loss of focus on generation? Because are we simply stumbling into the same problem again, failing to procure in time and failing to fix the roof while the sun is shining? So the increasing volume of private investment, but slow change in the proportion of capacity which is privately owned, is another reflection of the long and incomplete restructuring of African power sectors and the energy transition. So the growth rate of privately owned capacity has been larger than the growth of state-owned capacity in all but 5 years since 2001. So 75% of years growth of privately owned capacity has outstripped it, but that's not too surprising given that in 2001 there was a very low base. Growth slowed somewhat in the last decade from average of 7.7% in 2001 to 2010 to 6.6% in 2011 to 2020. So that's the growth rate of privately owned capacity. So while African markets have done a lot of work to open to private investment, the sector is basically unable to take off while tariffs remain below cost. Most recent estimates are that only 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have financially viable power sectors, and also while national utilities remain largely unreformed, playing a kind of uncomfortable role in increasingly untenable monopoly and monopsony positions, kind of sandwiched alongside IPPs and commercial industrial solar and diesel players. Similarly, having ceded what looked like the unprofitable and unreliable solar and wind sectors to IPPs at the start of the decade, African utilities have struggled to keep up with rapid changes in the sector or to make up any ground in that regard as prices have fallen, and they found that what looked like a nice safe bet of baseload thermal and hydro is actually not at all as safe and stable and profitable as was thought. So while in 2020, 3.7 times more state-owned capacity than privately owned capacity was operating in Africa overall, so 3.7 times more state-owned capacity than private. For solar and wind, the reverse was true, and nearly 4 times more privately owned solar and wind plants are operating than state-owned plants. Many governments are starting to abandon or scale down state-owned projects other than very large hydropower projects, which, as we saw earlier, remain hugely important in the growth of power, but the transition is too slow in terms of adding more capacity to the grid. So with scaling down state-owned capacity, but not ramping up privately owned capacity, private investment sufficiently due to inadequate reforms, partial reforms, indecisive policy, there are supply gaps opening up. Not enough utilities are taking the lesson of South Africa, where failure to reform quickly enough from 1997, 1998 onwards, ultimately resulted in a decade of huge economic damage, not just to the power sector, but really to the whole economy. Too many of the large economies are using the illusion of oversupply to drag their feet on much needed reforms or on attracting investment, which is resulting in increasing rental capacity. I think there's interesting examples of this. You have countries which have procured or contracted more power than they can sell, but while tariffs are very high, the power that they've procured is too expensive, and customers are choosing to go off-grid if they can, or they're being denied the opportunity to go off-grid, not just because power is expensive, but also because it's unreliable. There hasn't been enough investment in distribution and transmission. I think a country like Ghana is a good example where attempts to reform distribution and transmission have just been insufficient for a very long time. And oversupply has been used as a kind of another reason to put off much needed reforms. So, as I said in the opening, the UK has added 1.2 gigawatts of renewable power just to stand still in response to energy policy needs. And those who believe that Africa will avoid the need to reduce carbon intensity while aiming for industrialization may be in for a shock in the next few years. So this is the final slide. So this is looking at regional energy mixes across the decades. So you can see the inadequacy of growth in the sector is clear. There has been very consistent growth, but it's been quite steady across the decade, but it's not enough to be fueling the kind of growth that African leaders are aspiring to. Where the promise of solar and wind to reduce the use of expensive thermal power, balance hydropower, and reduce foreign exchange risks and tariffs is still to be realized, particularly in larger markets which have failed to run effective procurement processes or establish strong regulatory frameworks. So West Africa in particular remains beholden to gas, diesel, and HFO, with only limited progress developing hydropower projects, particularly the major markets of Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria. Very little progress on solar, wind, or the cheaper current technologies which could be used within the mix. The cost of service in the region remains unsurprisingly high and vulnerable, and utilities are vulnerable to off-grid developers. That said, frontier markets in the region have begun to take advantage of solar power, with Burkina Faso and Togo two standout examples. Mali has procured more solar power projects, or committed to more solar power projects than it can likely use the power from, and Chad had also begun to make progress with solar projects prior to the death of its president, Idris Deby. Mauritania has had some progress with a number of solar and solar hybrid projects. And Senegal, in particular, has established an impressive record of IPP procurement and has credible plans to pursue gas, wind, solar, and battery energy mix in the future. Interconnection could also create an interesting dynamic and will certainly help reduce the cost of power. So John mentioned that North Africa is at an inflection point. So is sub-Saharan Africa at a similar point? Is that why there's been a slowdown? Was it just COVID? There has certainly been movement in transitions to financially sustainable and cleaner sectors which can attract private investment. And this can be seen from steadily upward trajectory in each region. But the composition of the energy mix shows that the latest technologies have made only really, really limited inroads. And there is clearly nowhere near enough new capacity coming online to underpin the industrialization and economic growth that is desired and needed. While some countries may appear to have an oversupply, poorly procured and expensive plants mean that power remains expensive and utilities are unable to generate the revenues required to improve service quality quickly enough to prevent their most profitable companies or consumers migrating away from the grid, or even to prevent many customers a stone's throw from a distribution line from using a solar home system, which is significantly more expensive, because they feel they have control over their payments and the quality of supply. Similarly, private sector investment may be increasing, but in Central, East, and Southern Africa, state-owned hydropower projects are driving growth, far more than private gas, wind, or solar plants. So the question is, how long will it be before electricity sectors are sufficiently restructured that private projects can be, that enough projects can be developed on a private basis? And can Africa afford to wait that long? I think that's a really significant question. I also think that an alternative within this is the commercial and industrial space, which consumers are increasingly turning to in the absence of a reliable, cost-effective grid power supply. And with investors looking to pile into the sector because of lack of liquidity in the grid, politicians who have been mulling kind of ways to restrict grid migration through regulation, I think really need to decide whether the economy is there to serve utilities, with companies prevented from purchasing energy from the cheapest available sources and growing their businesses, or whether the utility is there to serve the economy. And I think that that is still a question that is more than a decade old in sub-Saharan Africa, really 2 decades old, and has still not been adequately resolved in enough cases. So that is the end of the presentation. I think there were 1 or 2 questions, which I will need to stop sharing in order to see. Hang on 1 second. So yes, so there's a question here about the IEA, which just released a report calling for the end of fossil fuels by 2025, and asking whether we could reflect on what we predict the trend in renewables relative to the dominance of natural gas and coal in the future will be, and particularly whether private investments will be increasingly constrained or difficult to acquire. I'll be interested to hear John's view on North Africa. I think on sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, the answer is really clear. I mean, fossil fuels and large-scale hydropower are going to continue to dominate the sector well up to 2025 and beyond. There's actually an interesting study using data from live data by the Oxford University, which used machine learning applied to the pipeline, which predicted that actually path dependency in the amount that's been invested in projects already means that actually fossil fuels will account for a really high proportion of installed capacity in Africa by 2030. Whether it's very clear in the pipeline that solar and wind are in particular growing hugely in sub-Saharan Africa, but not enough, and not in necessarily the larger markets to affect the overall numbers. So I mean, solar and wind certainly in some countries are going to be and are already hugely important. A lot of it will hinge on what the larger markets, Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, what they end up doing and whether they actually follow through with procurements, procure effectively, procure cheap power. but it's clear that there's already a huge sunk cost in fossil fuel generation in sub-Saharan Africa. There is a huge opportunity to replace that. A lot of it is thermal power in particular is aging. Frontier markets are particularly set to benefit from non-fossil fuel technologies. And I think that also feeds into the question, will gas be constrained? I think it's a very interesting question. We actually looked at a modeling project to assess this last year, but batteries for sure are already reducing demand for thermal power capacity. In Senegal, the studies that were done by for the project, battery project to mitigate the impact of Taiba and Ndiaye, 158 megawatt wind power plant there, showed that actually battery was cheaper than using the thermal power to manage that intermittency on the grid. I think that's increasingly the case. You have the World Bank is procuring a large solar battery plant in Bangui in Central African Republic. There's Golamati in Malawi, which is fairly, for the size of the country's grid, fairly substantial solar and battery project. Certainly it will impact on gas power plants. I think already we know that gas investors are asking themselves the question of whether their projects will survive a 25-year PPA. So I think that is it's a key question which I don't have a definitive answer to, but it's certainly being asked by a lot of people in the industry, and that in itself should tell you which way the wind is blowing. So yeah, John, I don't know if you had a view on North Africa, John.
Yes, definitely. John,
you're not muted, but I can't hear you. Oh wait, sorry. No, that's my fault. Sorry, go on.
Okay. No. Looking at Christopher's question, I mean, coal certainly. I think. That's easy. The Egypt's already got rid of its planned coal projects, and Morocco seem to be sort of edging off over further into the future, the ones they have planned. But in general, of course, the region, I think they've taken a sort of St. Augustine type approach to this, of saying sort of make me chaste, but not yet. So there's the possibility, say, I don't know, by 2025, it's quite, that's terribly soon, but within a foreseeable perspective, it's possible to imagine North Africa only commissioning new renewables projects based on the installed gas capacity, which will exist for a long time into the future, a very long time. But in order to do this, they're not immune from many of the trends that Dan's been talking about. The governments of all the North African countries will have to accept a massive restructuring of their sectors and the dismantling of decades-old institutional interests in order to allow this to happen. And it's so in theory, yes, but in practice, I think I can't see it. Another on the battery question, just because there's another thing which we haven't really spoken about at all, partly because it's, in a funny way, it's separate from all the discussion about power for Africa. North Africa's got this other sort of nascent trend, which is yet to actually produce any real projects, but there's increasing commitments to the idea that you can generate power in North Africa and export it to Europe via undersea high voltage DC cables. And the interesting thing there is that I mean, they're now looking at hybrid projects, sort of PV and concentrated solar power. But if you want more than 5 hours of storage, it's still cheaper to go via the CSP option than it is to have sort of PV plus battery. So, you know, so looking about whether, you know, that technology can ever, you know, could supplant gas in a major way, it's not there yet.
So just to respond to Jonathan's comment in the chat on the Oxford study, I mean, I certainly agree. The way that the Oxford study was done has a kind of path dependency built in, but I do think that it was still it's interesting within the rate of growth of installed capacity. Even if you pretty much stopped building much fossil fuels, you still end up with a very high proportion of fossil fuels within the mix. I think if you're talking about new capacity, certainly I think it's not impossible to fund HFO plants. Like we have seen HFO plants come online in the last few years with development funding, such as K's in Mali. There was development finance in the Western Area Power Project in Sierra Leone, although that's now fully private. Well, although it's got DFC funding, I believe. So, so there is funding available for HFO especially in frontier markets, and for sure, it's still possible to fund gas projects. You only need to look at Tamani, for example, in Mozambique, and the amount of financing around that. I do think that the question of stranded assets is potentially interesting, and like if you look at Ghana, you can see, I mean, if you look across the region, the trend towards renegotiations, and in Ghana in particular, affecting thermal plants, in other countries affecting renewables, high costs are not sustainable. So if ultimately, I think cost will be the key factor in determining a lot of these things, especially for plants that have already been built. The question is, if you've got especially if you have a thermal plant and your power is more expensive ultimately than new solar, wind, and batteries, if that turned out to be the case, I think that it's quite hard to make the case to keep the plant operating if you're concerned about climate change, and then you fall back on contracts and arbitration and all that kind of thing, which nobody ultimately really wants to do. So I think there is an interesting question there about stranded assets. I don't think that's really where we are yet, and hopefully, I think also one thing that we didn't mention in the presentation, but which we should have done, is that installed capacity is roughly doubled, I think, in the last 10 years in Africa. If it were to double again, then a lot of the costs that are now so significant just might not be so important. If as long as new capacity was cheaper and effectively procured. So I don't. There's a huge amount of there's so many dynamics in it that I think it's very interesting. Right. Well, we should probably stop there as we've already gone well over the time that we were meant to go over. So I think my colleague Alex Walk is on the call, and he will, for anybody interested in the platform itself, in live data, he will run a demonstration of what it looks like, the kind of data it contains now. But for all of you who've attended and stuck with us for the full hour, yeah, thank you very much for listening and for your contributions.
And I would say that there's a lot, as Dan has implied, there's a huge amount more that to be said and that the platform offers. And so if you're curious as to find out what there is or to ask some questions, get hold of us, and definitely get hold of Alex. Alex, just your, I mean, probably need a word from you quickly before everyone goes.
Hi there, yes. This is Alex. I've come off mute, haven't I? So you can all hear me. Yep, I'm available to show you the live data platform as you require it. But in